At 1:18 p.m. local time, midday light hung over the Caribbean Sea. The sky was clear, the air was calm, and the water below gave no hint that anything unusual was about to happen. High above it, a U.S. Navy fighter moved steadily along its assigned route. The engines were balanced, the sensors were working, and the pilot had settled into the familiar rhythm of a routine patrol. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, just another mission that could have ended as one more line in a flight log. Then the tone sounded. A sharp warning cut through the cockpit. Radar lock. Not a harmless sweep. Not a distant search pattern. This was focused and deliberate. The kind of signal that instantly changes the meaning of the moment. The pilot did not freeze. Training took over. Eyes moved to the threat display. Bearing confirmed. Distance tightening. This was no accident. Off the jet's left side, beyond visual range, Venezuelan fighters were closing in. They were low, fast, and aggressive, and they were not following the usual intercept routine. No radio contact, no identification request, no warning call on international frequencies, just pressure. In military aviation, there is a clear line between monitoring and threatening. Monitoring is observation. Threatening begins when someone signals they are prepared to take the next step. That line had just been crossed. Inside the cockpit, the warning pulsed again. The lock held steady. At that range, time shrinks fast. From radar lock to action can be only seconds. There is no room for a long debate. Only decision, instinct, and the knowledge that one wrong move can turn a patrol into a major international crisis. The pilot made a slight course adjustment. Not evasive, not provocative, just enough to change the geometry. Countermeasures were ready, but not used. No flares, no jamming, not yet. Discipline mattered. Every second of this would later be reviewed in detail. Outside, the Caribbean remained almost indifferent. Sunlight flashed across the water. No smoke, no streaks in the sky, just silence and speed. Then came visual contact. A Venezuelan jet suddenly cut into view at low altitude, close enough for the pilot to make out the markings, the shape of the aircraft, and the heat shimmer behind the engines. It was not a careful pass. It was not a cautious approach. It was a statement. Moments later, a second jet followed. Tighter, closer, more forceful. To anyone watching from afar, it might have looked like dominance. Two fighters pressing a single aircraft over open water, a display meant to project strength both at home and across the region. But what the Venezuelan pilots likely believed was only part of the picture. They probably thought they were confronting one aircraft, isolated and far from support, flying quietly over international waters. They assumed that getting close would create pressure, that noise and proximity would shift the balance in their favor. What they could not see was everything else. They could not see the wider network tracking the encounter in real time. They could not see the sensors beyond the horizon. They could not see that every radar pulse, every radio transmission, every burst of engine heat was being detected, stored, and analyzed. The closer they came, the more they revealed. Inside the American jet, the pilot stayed composed. No sudden turn, no emotional response, no move that could escalate the encounter. Just precise flying and constant awareness. The rules were clear. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do not provoke. Let the facts speak for themselves. And the facts were speaking loudly. Every aggressive maneuver revealed something. Every radar lock added another layer of understanding about Venezuelan tactics, capabilities, and limitations. This was no longer simple harassment. It had become something far more valuable, intelligence, freely handed over by the other side. For the Venezuelan pilots, the moment may have felt powerful. Fighter jets screaming close to an American aircraft, a visible challenge. The kind of image that could be turned into a story of defiance. But in modern conflict, the loudest move is often the most expensive mistake. Because while they believed they were applying pressure, they were actually stepping into a trap built from patience, discipline, and data. By the time the second pass ended and the Venezuelan jets widened their arc, nothing dramatic had happened in the visible sense. No weapons were launched, no rounds were fired, but the balance had already shifted. What began as an attempt to intimidate had quietly turned into a miscalculation with consequences far beyond the Caribbean. And the pilots making those passes likely had no idea. From Caracas, the decision may have looked carefully planned. In the days before the encounter, Venezuelan military activity across the Caribbean had increased. More patrols, more flying hours, more visible presence. It did not look like preparation for war. It looked like signaling, a reminder that Venezuela still intended to project relevance in a region where U.S. air and naval power dominates. The fighters that moved toward the American jet were not there by chance. They were guided in deliberately by ground controllers, watching the same radar picture and calculating the same intercept angles. This was not a casual flyby. It was a test, a pressure tactic, an attempt to force a reaction without tipping into open conflict. At least that was the plan. The problem was execution. Professional intercepts follow a known pattern. Identify, communicate, maintain distance, reduce tension. Even rivals understand those rules because the alternative is chaos at high speed. But here, that script was ignored. The Venezuelan jets came in fast, low, and close enough to trigger clear warning tones. One of them shifted from search radar into track mode again, briefly but deliberately. That mattered. A radar lock is not just a technical act. It is a message. It says, "I have you." Even without a launch, the meaning is unmistakable. And intention is what shapes rules of engagement. Inside the American cockpit, the threat receiver confirmed it all. This was no longer routine pressure. It had become escalation. Even so, the response stayed controlled. No flares, no jamming, no sudden break that could be misread as fear or aggression. The aircraft held its line, made a slight altitude change, and kept its speed. The pilot's hands stayed light on the controls. Breathing stayed steady, because reactions driven by emotion are exactly what these encounters are designed to provoke. From the Venezuelan side, the move likely felt effective. They had the visual advantage. They were closer, louder, more dramatic. For a domestic audience, that kind of image works well. National fighters challenging an American aircraft, a visible display of sovereignty and resolve. But air combat is not theater. Every second they remained close, every system they powered on, every maneuver they flew was being measured. Modern fighter aircraft are not just weapons, they are flying sensor platforms. And when aircraft come this close, they are not only watching each other, they are listening. During one pass, the Venezuelan pilots briefly pushed their afterburners, cutting through the humid Caribbean air. The heat flare behind them was obvious. On infrared systems, it was impossible to miss. Their radios crackled with short, clip transmissions back to controllers ashore. No casual chatter, just tasking, corrections, and updates. Each signal added another detail to the growing profile. This is the part most people never see. Beneath the visible encounter was an invisible exchange. Radar frequencies, pulse behavior, communication habits, reaction times, formation discipline under pressure. Those details matter far more than dramatic flybys. Inside the U.S. aircraft, the systems recorded it all, quietly, methodically, professionally. There was no need to chase, no need to threaten back. The Venezuelan aircraft were revealing enough on their own. One fighter cut tighter on the second pass, crossing closer than before. Close enough for wake turbulence to ripple faintly across the American jet. Close enough that one small error, one bad correction at combined speeds well above 1,000 miles per hour could have ended in catastrophe. That was the point where the line became unmistakable. This was no longer only about sending a message. It had become an attempt to force the American pilot to blink first, to see how far they could push without consequence. And that is where the real misjudgment was made, because U.S. military strength is not measured by who gets louder or closer. It is measured by composure, by how well people operate under pressure, by how much they reveal when stressed. The American aircraft did not peel away. It did not overreact. It did not escalate. It simply remained there. That restraint sent its own message, and it was far more unsettling. It said, "We are not rattled. We are watching." As the Venezuelan formation widened again and began to pull farther off, the encounter ended not with noise, but with silence. Yet by then, the true exchange had already taken place. Venezuela had attempted to create pressure through aggression. Instead, it had exposed its own tactics, habits, and limits to a system specifically built to absorb provocation and convert it into advantage. And the pilots involved may have believed the moment was over. They had no way of knowing that what they had just done would shape everything that followed. To an outside observer, it may have looked like restraint in the simplest sense. No visible response, no pursuit, no dramatic maneuver, just an American jet continuing on course while Venezuelan fighters pressed close and then withdrew. To an untrained eye, it might even have looked passive. It was not passive, it was calculated. Modern military aviation is not defined only by what a pilot sees through the canopy. It is also about what the aircraft is collecting in the background. And during those tense minutes over the Caribbean, that is exactly what the American jet was doing. Every radar sweep that touched the aircraft, every radio transmission, every heat spike from engines being pushed hard, all of it was being logged. The Venezuelan pilots seemed to believe proximity created power. But in reality, proximity creates exposure. The closer an aircraft gets, the clearer its signature becomes. And a signature is a fingerprint, unique, measurable, and impossible to erase once captured. When the Venezuelan fighters changed radar modes, even briefly, they disclosed far more than intended. Radar is not just energy in the air, it is a language. Pulse repetition, frequency shifts, scan behavior, all of it tells analysts what system is being used, how it is configured, and how it performs under strain. The American aircraft did not need to answer with jamming or counterlocks. Silence was enough. The quieter one side stayed, the louder the other side became. As the Venezuelan jets maneuvered, their formation loosened slightly. small deviations, minor timing mismatches. The kind of flaws that may not appear in dramatic footage, but stand out immediately to trained analysts. Those details say a great deal about training quality, command discipline, and operational readiness. Then, there was the engine heat. At one point, one of the Venezuelan pilots pushed hard, either to hold position or to make the pass look more forceful. The afterburner flare was brief but bright on infrared systems. Exhaust pattern, temperature curve, throttle response. More details added to the file. None of this required confrontation. The American jet stayed steady, collecting, measuring, remembering. Every onboard system was doing its job. This was not a duel. It was a diagnostic test, and the Venezuelan pilots never realized they were the ones being evaluated. When they finally widened their arc and pulled back to a safer distance, they likely felt they had made their point. They had flown hard. They had forced attention. They had shown they were willing to challenge U.S. aircraft over open water. But the truth was less flattering. They had just given away something more valuable than a brief moment of intimidation. They had handed over a snapshot of how they operate under pressure, how they maneuver, how they communicate, how their systems behave when pushed. In modern military competition, that kind of insight is invaluable. This is the part that rarely becomes a headline. No dramatic visuals, no fireballs, no footage repeated on a loop, just data, quiet, exact, permanent, moving through a network far larger than a single aircraft. By the time the Venezuelan jets turned for home, the encounter was already over in the most meaningful sense. The American pilot continued the mission, calm and professional. No visible sign of disruption, no emergency call, just a clean continuation of flight. But elsewhere, far from the Caribbean, analysts would begin studying what had been gathered. Not emotionally, not politically, clinically. They would note which systems were active, which stayed silent, how quickly the pilots reacted, where hesitation appeared, where confidence held, where it weakened. Patterns emerge in moments like this, and patterns are what militaries prepare against. The Venezuelan pilots may have thought they confronted one aircraft. What they actually encountered was an entire system, one that rewards patience and punishes impulsive behavior. By choosing intimidation instead of disengagement, they moved into a space where every action became information. And once information is collected, it does not disappear. The sky over the Caribbean returned to calm. The aircraft separated. The moment passed. But the consequences remained because from that point on, the balance was no longer about who flew louder or closer. It was about who learned more. And in that exchange, the advantage shifted decisively without a single shot. From the outside, it looked like nothing happened. No launches, no emergency briefings, no sudden flood of headlines. The Venezuelan jets broke away, the American aircraft stayed on patrol, and the sea below remained as calm as before. But the absence of visible reaction does not mean there was no response. In modern military operations, the most important actions often happen far from cameras. Within minutes of the encounter ending, the data collected during those passes was already moving through secure channels. Radar logs, infrared captures, snippets of radio traffic, time-stamped, geo-referenced, complete. This is what restraint looks like when it is backed by real capability. The American pilot filed a routine report. No drama, no embellishment, only facts, times, bearings, distance, system activity, behavior. Every relevant detail, nothing extra. That report would become one piece of a much larger picture, because the aircraft over the Caribbean was not operating alone. It was part of a layered architecture built to absorb pressure without reacting impulsively. Sensors in the air, at sea, and in orbit all fed into the same network. What one aircraft saw, others could confirm. What one system detected, others could cross-check. The Venezuelan pilots may have believed they were confronting a single opponent. In reality, they were engaging an entire structure, and that structure does not respond emotionally. Instead of dramatic retaliation, posture shifted quietly. Patrol patterns were adjusted, coverage windows refined, contingency plans reviewed. Not as a panicked reaction, but as a continuation of readiness. This is where many adversaries misunderstand the situation. They expect response to look visible and theatrical. A loud show of force, a direct answer, something easy to point at. But for a professional military, response is about position, not performance. The U.S. aircraft kept flying. Other aircraft kept flying too. Not in a parade, not in a dramatic display, but present, steady, predictable in the way that matters most, always there. The encounter itself was brief, but it did not vanish. It became a reference point, a data set, another piece in a long chain of observations used to refine understanding of regional behavior. Nothing about it was wasted. Elsewhere, the information gathered would feed training cycles and planning assumptions, not just for the next day, but for years. Because what matters is not what a force can do in ideal conditions. It is what it does under pressure, when timing shrinks and instinct takes over. That is what the Venezuelan pilots revealed. From their perspective, the lack of immediate reaction may have looked like success. No interceptors surging in, no aggressive chase, no public outcry. It may even have seemed as though the Americans chose to ignore it. They did not ignore it, they documented it. The discipline shown by the U.S. pilot was not accidental. It is trained, reinforced, expected. Every military aviator understands that restraint under provocation is not weakness. It is control. It preserves options. It prevents costly mistakes. And it forces the other side to reveal itself first. In this case, that happened clearly. There were no retaliatory passes, no dramatic shift meant to capture attention, because attention was never the objective. Understanding was. As the days passed, nothing outwardly changed. Flights continued, patrols continued. The region stayed stable, at least on the surface. That normalcy is part of the strategy. When presence becomes routine, intimidation loses value. And that is where the real shift occurred. By refusing to escalate, the U.S. denied Venezuela the result it was probably seeking. Drama, validation, reaction. Instead, the incident became another logged event, stripped of spectacle and emotion. But it mattered, because in future encounters, that data will shape decisions. It will influence how much risk is accepted, how patterns are interpreted, how quickly behavior is recognized. The Venezuelan pilots walked away thinking they had pushed the line and escaped consequence. In reality, they pushed it just far enough to be studied. And the response they never saw, the quiet adjustments, the deeper awareness, the sharper understanding, was already underway. All of it without a single aircraft breaking formation or a single weapon leaving its rail. In the end, no one fired. No wreckage hit the sea. No pilots abandoned their aircraft. No emergency meetings dominated the news cycle. On the surface, the encounter faded almost as quickly as it appeared. A few tense minutes over international waters, then distance, then silence. But that is not how militaries measure outcomes. What matters is not what exploded. It is what changed. For Venezuela, the encounter was supposed to project resolve, a signal that its air force could still challenge American presence in the Caribbean. A reminder, especially for audiences at home, that its pilots were willing to push close and apply pressure. But pressure without leverage is only noise. By choosing intimidation over professionalism, the Venezuelan pilots disclosed more than they intended. They showed how their aircraft behave near performance limits, how their formations loosen under stress, how communication changes when seconds matter. Those are not abstract details. They are operational realities. For the United States, the result reinforced a lesson learned many times over decades of close encounters. Restraint combined with capability creates asymmetry. It forces the other side to act, to transmit, to expose. The side that stays quiet learns. The side that gets loud teaches. This was never about winning an aerial battle. It was about avoiding one altogether and still leaving with the advantage. The American pilot did exactly what doctrine demands. He did not chase drama. He did not seek recognition. He maintained course, maintained discipline, and allowed the situation to reveal itself. That choice kept escalation off the table while preserving every option if events had moved in a worse direction. That balance is difficult. It requires confidence, not just in the aircraft, but in the system behind it. Confidence that you are not alone. Confidence that restraint will not be mistaken for weakness by the people who matter. The Venezuelan pilots, by contrast, gambled on closeness. They assumed proximity meant control. But in modern air combat, closeness often means vulnerability. It shortens reaction time, magnifies error, and turns every move into measurable data. Once that data exists, it cannot be taken back. From that point forward, every future encounter will be shaped by what was learned in those minutes over the Caribbean. Not emotionally, not politically, practically, quietly, permanently. That is why this was a mistake. Not because it nearly started a war, it did not. But because it created clarity where uncertainty once existed. And uncertainty is often one of the few protections a weaker force still has. There is a reason professional militaries emphasize de-escalation procedures, standardized intercepts, and clear communication. Those rules are not about politeness. They are about survival. They exist to stop moments like this from becoming irreversible. When those rules are ignored, even briefly, the price is rarely paid in that exact moment. It is paid later, in planning rooms, in simulations, in future encounters, where surprise is now harder to achieve. That day, the Caribbean returned to calm. Shipping lanes stayed busy, patrols continued. On paper, nothing changed. In reality, everything did, because one side learned and the other side taught. And in modern military competition, that kind of imbalance only grows over time. So the real question that remains long after the jets disappear is this. When pressure comes at high speed and close range, what shows greater strength, reacting instantly or remaining completely steady? This time, the answer was written without spectacle, without warnings, and without a single shot. It was written in discipline. And that is why Venezuela did not simply challenge the wrong aircraft. It revealed exactly why it should not have.